The baseball cap tumbled through the air like a wounded bird, carried by the sudden Texas wind that had turned their peaceful Sunday barbecue into a nightmare. Frank Mitchell's weathered hands shot up instinctively, but it was too late. 67 years of stubborn pride stripped away in an instant. Emma's scream pierced the afternoon silence. "Oh my God, Grandpa!" The 13-year-old stumbled backward, her burger dropping to the patio stones as she stared at her grandfather's exposed scalp. Deep, circular wounds dotted his head like angry red craters, some weeping yellow pus, others revealing glimpses of bone beneath infected flesh that had been festering in darkness for months. Sarah's coffee mug shattered against the concrete. The other 7 grandchildren froze mid-laugh, their faces transforming from joy to horror as the sickening sweet smell of infection hit the summer air. Frank's trembling fingers fumbled desperately for his fallen cap, the same hands that had built their family home now shaking with shame and terror. "Call 911!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. "Call them now!" How long had he been dying in silence? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Frank Mitchell had been a different man. At 67, he still carried himself with the straight-backed pride of a Korean War veteran who'd spent 45 years swinging hammers and pouring concrete under the merciless Texas sun. His calloused hands bore the honest scars of a man who'd built half the houses in their Austin neighborhood, including the modest 2-bedroom home where he'd raised Sarah and watched 8 grandchildren take their first steps on the front porch he'd crafted himself. A man provides for his family no matter what, Frank would tell anyone who'd listen, his voice carrying the weight of old-school American values. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you never, ever become a burden. These weren't just words to Frank, they were gospel, passed down from his Depression-era father and reinforced through decades of honest labor. But that was before Martha died. Martha Mitchell had been Frank's anchor for 45 years. The gentle voice that could talk him down from his stubborn streaks and remind him that asking for help wasn't the same as giving up. When the cancer came, Frank fought it like he'd fought everything else in his life, with grit, determination, and every penny they had. The medical bills piled up like autumn leaves: chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments that Medicare wouldn't touch. Frank watched their savings evaporate, then their retirement fund, and finally, in a decision that nearly broke him, he'd secretly signed over the deed to their home to cover Martha's final months in the hospital. Now he was a renter in his own house, paying monthly to live in rooms he'd built with his own hands. The new owners, a young couple from California, had been kind enough to let him stay, but the shame ate at Frank like acid. Every morning he woke up in the bedroom where Martha had drawn her last breath, surrounded by walls that no longer belonged to him. Sarah, his 42-year-old daughter, had her own struggles. Divorced 2 years ago when her husband decided he couldn't handle the stress of caring for aging parents, she now juggled 2 jobs: serving tables at Murphy's Diner during the day and cleaning office buildings at night. Her hands were as calloused as her father's, but from different kinds of work, different kinds of sacrifice. Emma Thompson, Sarah's youngest at 13, was the light of Frank's world. Quick-witted and observant, she had Martha's gentle eyes and Frank's stubborn chin. She was the one who still believed her grandfather could fix anything, the one who didn't yet understand that some problems couldn't be solved with hard work and determination. The modest house on Maple Street had once been filled with laughter and the smell of Martha's Sunday pot roast. Now it felt hollow, haunted by medical debt and the ghost of a woman who'd made everything make sense. Frank's pension barely covered the rent, and his pride wouldn't let him apply for assistance programs that might have helped. "I'm not a charity case," he'd mutter, whenever Sarah suggested Medicaid or food stamps. "I've worked every day since I was 14 years old." That pride would nearly kill him. 3 months before that fateful Sunday barbecue, Frank Mitchell stood before his bathroom mirror at 5:30 in the morning, razor poised halfway to his weathered cheek. Something was wrong. A small red circle, perfectly round and angry-looking, had appeared on his scalp just above his left ear. He leaned closer to the mirror, squinting in the dim light of the single bulb that had flickered for months, but never quite died. "Just a bug bite," he muttered, running a finger gently around the raised edge. It felt warm to the touch, tender, but not unbearable. Texas was full of critters that bit and stung. Fire ants, mosquitoes, chiggers. A man who'd worked construction for 4 decades had dealt with worse. But as he continued shaving, Martha's voice echoed in his memory like a gentle ghost. "Frank Mitchell, don't you dare be stubborn about your health. Promise me you won't suffer in silence like your father did." He'd made that promise 8 months ago, holding her frail hand in the hospital room that had cost them everything. But promises to the dead, Frank had discovered, were harder to keep than promises to the living. The red spot burned slightly as he combed his thinning gray hair over it. Nothing a little neosporin couldn't handle. He'd survived Korea, raised a daughter, buried his parents and now his wife. Surely he could handle one little skin irritation without running to a doctor like some hypochondriac. That afternoon, Frank drove his rusted Ford pickup to the dollar store on East Riverside, the kind of place where retired folks on fixed incomes stretched their dollars until they screamed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he wandered the health and beauty aisle, studying the various ointments and creams with the same intensity he'd once applied to reading blueprints. "Antibacterial healing ointment," he read aloud from a small tube that cost $1.99. "Good for cuts, scrapes, and minor skin irritations." Perfect. He grabbed 3 tubes along with a package of large bandages and a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. At home, Frank locked himself in the bathroom and applied the ointment liberally to the red spot, which seemed to have grown slightly since morning. The bandage covered it completely, and he combed his hair over the whole area. Problem solved, he told himself. No need to worry Sarah or burden her with medical bills they couldn't afford, but the spot had other plans. Within a week, the burning sensation had intensified to a constant throb that made sleep elusive. Frank found himself unconsciously touching the area throughout the day, feeling the heat radiating through his hair. When he changed the bandage each morning, the red circle looked angrier, more defined, as if something was eating away at his skin from the inside out. Maybe it needs air to heal, he reasoned, and stopped using bandages altogether. Instead, he took to wearing his old Astros baseball cap, the one he'd worn during countless construction jobs, the one that had shielded him from sun and rain for 20 years. The cap became his armor, his shield against a world that might ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. 2 weeks later, Frank discovered he wasn't fighting one spot anymore, but 3. They appeared overnight like malevolent stars, forming a triangular pattern on the left side of his scalp. Each one was perfectly circular, each one throbbed with its own rhythm of pain. The skin around them had taken on a yellowish tinge that reminded Frank uncomfortably of the infection that had claimed his father's leg during his final years. The internet, which Frank normally avoided like the plague, became his secret research partner. Late at night, when Sarah and Emma were asleep, he'd hunker down at Sarah's old laptop and type in searches: red circles on scalp, skin infection elderly men, home remedies skin problems. The results terrified him more than comforted him. Words like cellulitis, sepsis, and emergency treatment filled his screen like digital vultures. But emergency treatment meant emergency room bills. Emergency room bills meant Sarah would discover the truth about their financial situation. And that truth would destroy the last shred of dignity Frank had left. So he increased his home treatment regimen. More ointment, stronger hydrogen peroxide, even some apple cider vinegar he'd read about in a home remedy blog. The baseball cap became a permanent fixture, worn from the moment he woke up until he went to bed. When Emma asked why he never took it off anymore, even during their weekly family dinners, Frank would ruffle her hair and say, "A man's got to have some mystery, sweetheart." The mystery was killing him, one infected cell at a time. But Frank Mitchell had survived worse than a few red spots on his head. He'd buried a wife, lost a home, and still managed to smile when his granddaughter looked at him like he hung the moon. He could handle this too. He had to handle it, because the alternative, becoming the burden he'd spent his entire life refusing to be, was worse than any physical pain his body could inflict. 6 weeks before the barbecue that would change everything, Sarah Mitchell Thompson sat across from her father at Murphy's Diner during her 15-minute break, watching him nurse a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Something was wrong. After 42 years of reading Frank Mitchell's moods, Sarah could sense trouble like a storm front moving across the Texas plains. "Dad, you've been wearing that cap for 3 weeks straight," she said, stirring sugar into her own coffee with more force than necessary. "Even when you sleep. Emma mentioned it yesterday." Frank's weathered hand instinctively moved to adjust the battered Astros cap, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. A man's got a right to his privacy, doesn't he? "Maybe I'm going bald and don't want to scare the grandkids." "You've been bald since I was in high school," Sarah shot back, her voice carrying the exasperation of a woman who'd been fighting her father's stubborn streak her entire life. "And you never cared before. Hell, you used to joke about having a solar panel for a head." The attempted humor fell flat. Frank stared out the diner's greasy window at the parking lot where his ancient Ford pickup sat like a rusted monument to better times. His hands, Sarah noticed, trembled slightly as he lifted the coffee cup to his lips. When had her father, the man who'd single-handedly framed houses in 100-degree heat, started shaking like an old man? "Dad, talk to me," Sarah pressed, leaning forward across the red vinyl booth. "You've been acting strange for weeks. You won't eat dinner with us anymore. You barely speak during family movie night. And yesterday, Emma found you taking a nap in the garage. The garage, Dad." In 90-degree weather. Frank's jaw tightened with the same stubborn set Sarah remembered from childhood arguments about bedtimes and homework. "A man's entitled to rest wherever he pleases in his own—" He stopped mid-sentence, the word home dying on his lips like a prayer in an empty church. That's when Sarah knew. The foreclosure notices she'd found stuffed in his truck's glove compartment 3 days ago suddenly made terrible sense. Her father, the man who'd built their house with his own hands, who'd taught her that a home was more than walls and a roof, he was keeping secrets that were eating him alive. "Dad, I found the papers," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the diner's clatter of plates and conversation. "I know about the house." Frank's face crumpled like wet cardboard. For a moment, the proud veteran who'd never shown weakness in front of his daughter looked every one of his 67 years. His hands, those same hands that had carried her on his shoulders and taught her to swing a hammer, covered his face as if he could hide from the truth. "I failed her," he whispered through his fingers. 45 years of marriage, and I couldn't even keep a roof over Martha's head when she needed it most. What kind of man does that make me?" Sarah reached across the table and gently pulled his hands away from his face. "It makes you a man who loved his wife enough to sell everything to try to save her. Dad, you didn't fail Mom. The system failed you both." "Don't," Frank said sharply, straightening in the booth. "Don't make excuses for me. I had insurance, I had savings, I had a pension, and it still wasn't enough. Your mother died in debt because I couldn't provide what she needed." The bitterness in his voice cut through Sarah like a blade. This wasn't just about money or medical bills. This was about everything Frank Mitchell believed about himself as a man, a husband, a provider. She watched her father's hands shake as he fumbled for his wallet, and for the first time she noticed how thin he'd gotten. When had his work shirts started hanging on his frame like laundry on a line? "Promise me something," Frank said suddenly, his eyes meeting hers with desperate intensity. "Promise me you won't tell the kids. Emma especially. She doesn't need to know her grandfather's a failure who lost the family home." "Dad, you're not a failure. Promise me, Sarah." His voice carried the same authoritative tone he'd used when she was 8 years old and trying to argue her way out of chores. "Those kids have enough to worry about with your divorce and your job situation. They don't need to carry this burden, too." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that families shared burdens, and that was what made them families. But the look in her father's eyes, a mixture of shame and desperate pride, stopped her. She recognized that look. She'd seen it in the mirror plenty of times since her own divorce, when she'd worked double shifts to avoid asking for help, when she'd skipped meals to make sure her kids had what they needed. "Okay, Dad, I promise. But only if you promise me something in return." Frank nodded warily. "Promise me you'll let me help. I've been picking up extra shifts and I've got some money saved. We can figure this out together." For a moment, Frank's expression softened, and Sarah glimpsed the father who'd bandaged her scraped knees and stayed up all night teaching her algebra when she was failing high school math. But then the walls went back up, stronger than before. "I appreciate the offer, sweetheart, but I won't take money from a single mother working 2 jobs. You got your own kids to worry about." "Your grandchildren, Dad." "They're your grandchildren, too. And that's exactly why I won't burden them with this mess." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like smoke. Sarah watched her father's reflection in the window and realized she was looking at a man slowly disappearing into himself. The confident construction foreman who'd raised her to believe she could do anything was fading before her eyes, replaced by someone she barely recognized. "Dad, are you feeling okay? I mean, physically? You look tired." Frank's hand moved to his cap again, that unconscious gesture that Sarah was beginning to understand meant deflection. "I'm fine. Just not sleeping well since your mother passed. The house feels too quiet." Another lie, Sarah realized. But this one felt different, heavier somehow. There was something her father wasn't telling her, something beyond the financial troubles and the grief. She made a mental note to pay closer attention, to watch for signs she might have missed while juggling her own overwhelming responsibilities. As they left the diner, Frank stumbled slightly on the step, catching himself against the doorframe. When Sarah asked if he was okay, he brushed off her concern with a gruff, "Just clumsy old age." But Sarah had seen the flash of pain that crossed his face, the way he'd winced as if something on his head had been jostled. Something was wrong, terribly, dangerously wrong, and her father's pride was going to kill him before he'd admit it. She just didn't know how right she was. Emma Thompson had always been the detective of the family. At 13, she possessed the kind of sharp observational skills that came from being the youngest of 8 grandchildren. You learned to notice things when you had to fight for attention in a crowd. But lately, all her detective instincts were focused on one mystery. What was wrong with Grandpa Frank? It started with small things. The way he'd begun wearing his baseball cap to bed, something she'd discovered during one of her midnight trips to the kitchen for water. She'd peeked into his room and seen him sleeping fully clothed, the Astros cap still firmly planted on his head, even in the Texas heat that made their old house feel like an oven. Then there were the pill bottles. Emma had been taking out the trash when she noticed them buried beneath coffee grounds and banana peels, small amber containers with labels she couldn't quite read in the dim light. But she'd seen enough medical shows with her mom to recognize prescription bottles when she saw them. The strange thing was, Grandpa Frank had always bragged about never taking so much as an aspirin, claiming his generation was tougher than that. "Mom, is Grandpa sick?" Emma had asked Sarah one evening as they folded laundry together in the living room. The question had been bouncing around in her head for weeks, growing heavier each day. Sarah's hands had stilled on the towel she was folding, and Emma saw something flicker across her mother's face. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "He just seems different. He doesn't laugh at my jokes anymore, and he won't play checkers with me. Last Sunday he fell asleep during the Cowboys game. Grandpa Frank never falls asleep during football. People change as they get older, Em. Grandpa's been through a lot since Grandma Martha died." Sometimes grief makes people act differently. But Emma wasn't satisfied with that answer. Grief didn't explain why her grandfather flinched every time someone got too close to his head, or why he'd started wearing cologne that smelled like it was trying to cover up something else, something sour and wrong that made Emma's stomach turn when she hugged him. 2 weeks before the barbecue, Emma had decided to do some investigating of her own. She waited until Sarah was at her night cleaning job and Frank was in the garage, tinkering with an old lawnmower that hadn't run in years. The computer in Sarah's bedroom was ancient, but it had internet, and Emma had learned enough from school research projects to navigate her way around Google. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed, "Red spots on scalp, elderly men." The results made her stomach drop. Pictures of infected wounds, medical terminology she didn't understand, and warnings about seeking immediate medical attention filled the screen. She tried different searches: head infection symptoms, scalp problems, grandfather, when to call Dr. Head Wound. Each search led her deeper into a rabbit hole of medical websites that used words like sepsis and life-threatening with alarming frequency. Emma printed out several articles, hiding them under her mattress like the diary she'd kept when her parents were getting divorced, secrets that felt too big and scary to carry alone. But the real breakthrough came 3 days later, during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday evening. Emma had been in her room doing homework when she heard a crash from the bathroom, followed by the sound of her grandfather swearing, something Frank Mitchell rarely did in front of the grandchildren. She'd crept down the hallway and pressed her ear to the bathroom door. Through the thin wood, she could hear water running and her grandfather's voice, low and pained. "Come on, Frank. Pull yourself together. You can't let them see." Emma had held her breath, straining to hear more. "Martha, I'm sorry." Frank's voice had continued, barely above a whisper. "I promised I wouldn't be stubborn about my health. But I can't. I can't burden them with this. Not after everything else." The water stopped running, and Emma heard the distinct sound of bottles being opened, multiple bottles like someone going through a medicine cabinet. She'd counted at least 4 different containers being opened and closed, accompanied by her grandfather's quiet groans of pain. When Frank finally emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, his face was pale and drawn, and Emma noticed for the first time how much weight he'd lost. His favorite flannel shirt, the one Grandma Martha had bought him for Christmas 3 years ago, hung on his frame like a scarecrow's costume. "Hey there, sweetheart," he'd said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Shouldn't you be doing homework?" "I finished," Emma had lied, studying her grandfather's face. Up close she could see the exhaustion carved into every line, the way his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his ever-present baseball cap. "Grandpa, are you feeling okay?" "Right as rain," Frank had replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Just tired. Old men need more sleep than they used to." But Emma had seen the way he'd gripped the doorframe for support, the flash of agony that had crossed his face when he'd moved too quickly. Whatever was wrong with her grandfather, it was getting worse. That night, Emma had lain awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about the medical articles hidden under her mattress, about the pill bottles in the trash, about the way her mother's face had looked when she'd asked if Grandpa was sick. Everyone was keeping secrets, and those secrets were eating her family alive from the inside out. The next morning, Emma had made a decision that would have impressed Grandma Martha with its stubborn determination. She was going to watch her grandfather like a hawk, documenting everything she observed. If the adults in her family were too scared or too proud to face the truth, then it was up to her to figure out what was really going on. She started a notebook, writing down everything she noticed. The times Frank disappeared into the bathroom with a plastic bag of supplies, the way he winced when loud noises happened near his head, the increasing frequency of his headaches that kept him in darkened rooms. She noted the smell that seemed to follow him, sweet and sickly, like fruit left too long in the sun. Emma also began paying closer attention to the family dynamics swirling around her. She noticed how her mother's eyes followed Frank everywhere he went, the worry lines that had deepened around Sarah's mouth over the past month. She saw how her Uncle Tom, Frank's brother, had started calling more frequently, conversations that ended abruptly when Emma entered the room. The weekend before the barbecue, Emma had witnessed something that confirmed her worst fears. She'd been getting a glass of water from the kitchen when she heard her mother on the phone in the living room, her voice hushed but urgent. "I don't know what to do anymore," Sarah had been saying to someone on the other end. "He's getting worse, but he won't let me help. Yesterday I found him passed out in the garage, and when I tried to take him to the doctor, he threatened to move out." Emma had pressed herself against the kitchen wall, straining to hear more. I know," Sarah had continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But you didn't see him, Linda. He looked like he was dying, and I can't lose him, too. Not after Mom." The conversation had continued for another 10 minutes, filled with medical terminology and insurance concerns that Emma didn't fully understand but recognized as adult problems, the kind that kept her mother awake at night and made her cry in the shower where she thought no one could hear. When Sarah had finally hung up, Emma had heard her mother collapse onto the couch with a sound that was half sigh, half sob. It was the sound of someone drowning in responsibilities too big for one person to carry. That night, Emma had added a new entry to her notebook. "Mom knows something is really wrong. She's scared. They're both lying to protect each other. But the lying is making everything worse." The final piece of the puzzle had come just 2 days before the barbecue. Emma had been helping her grandfather carry folding chairs from the garage when a gust of wind had caught his baseball cap, lifting it slightly off his head. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, Emma had glimpsed what lay beneath. The sight had made her stomach lurch. Even in that brief flash, she'd seen red, angry-looking spots on her grandfather's scalp, wounds that looked infected and wrong. Frank had quickly pressed the cap back down, but not before Emma had seen the fear in his eyes. The same fear she'd been carrying in her chest for weeks. "Grandpa," she'd said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, "maybe you should see a doctor." Frank's face had hardened with that stubborn expression Emma knew meant the conversation was over. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just fine." But they both knew he was lying. As Emma lay in bed the night before the barbecue, listening to the sound of her grandfather moving restlessly in the room next door, she made a decision that would change everything. If her family was too scared to face the truth, then maybe it was time for the truth to find them. She just didn't know that tomorrow a simple gust of Texas wind would make that decision for her. Sunday afternoon arrived with the kind of oppressive Texas heat that made the air shimmer like liquid mercury above the asphalt. The Mitchell family barbecue was a monthly tradition that had survived divorces, deaths, and financial hardships, one of the few constants in their increasingly chaotic lives. Frank had insisted on hosting despite Sarah's gentle suggestions that maybe Uncle Tom's house would be better this time with its working air conditioning and bigger backyard. "This is still my house," Frank had declared with the kind of finality that ended all arguments. "I may rent it now, but it's still where this family gathers." By 3 o'clock, the backyard was filled with the controlled chaos of 8 grandchildren ranging in age from 6 to 17. Emma watched her grandfather from across the yard, noting how he kept adjusting his baseball cap even though there wasn't a cloud in the crystal blue sky to provide shade. He'd been wearing that same Astros cap for over a month now, and it had become as much a part of his appearance as his weathered hands or his careful, measured way of speaking. Sarah bustled around the makeshift serving table, arranging store-bought potato salad and coleslaw alongside her homemade baked beans. Money was too tight for the elaborate spreads they'd enjoyed when Martha was alive, but no one mentioned the substitutions. The family had gotten good at not talking about the things that hurt. "Grandpa, come throw the football with us," called out Jake, Emma's 15-year-old cousin, waving a worn leather ball that had seen countless family gatherings. The boys' enthusiasm was infectious, and several of the younger kids joined in the chorus of pleas for their grandfather to join their game. Frank forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe later, kiddo. Let me help your Aunt Sarah get the burgers started." Emma noticed the way her grandfather gripped the edge of the picnic table as he stood, the brief flash of pain that crossed his face before he managed to compose himself. She'd been documenting these moments in her secret notebook for weeks now, and the frequency was increasing. Whatever was wrong with him was getting worse, not better. "Dad, why don't you sit down and let me handle the grill?" Sarah suggested, already moving toward the ancient propane barbecue that Frank had assembled from scrap parts 15 years ago. "You've been on your feet all morning getting ready for this." "I can still flip a burger," Frank replied, his voice carrying that edge of defensiveness Emma had come to recognize. "I'm not an invalid." The word hung in the air like smoke from the grill, heavy and uncomfortable. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. The family had learned to navigate around Frank's pride the way you might walk around broken glass, carefully and with the knowledge that one wrong step could draw blood. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky remained stubbornly clear. Texas weather could change faster than a teenager's mood, and everyone knew it. Frank squinted toward the horizon, his hand unconsciously moving to adjust his cap again. "Might get some rain later," he observed, using the kind of neutral tone reserved for weather talk when you wanted to avoid more dangerous topics. Emma's cousin Lucy, barely 6 years old and blessed with the kind of fearless curiosity that adults had long since learned to suppress, wandered over to where Frank stood manning the grill. She was small enough that her head barely reached his waist, and she tilted it back to look up at him with the serious expression children wore when they were about to ask uncomfortable questions. "Grandpa Frank," she said in that clear, carrying voice that made every adult within hearing distance tense slightly. "How come you never take your hat off anymore? Mommy says it's rude to wear hats inside." Frank's hand moved to his cap so quickly it looked like a reflex, pressing it more firmly onto his head. "Well, sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups have different rules than little kids." "But you used to take it off," Lucy persisted with the kind of relentless logic that only children could muster. "At Grandma Martha's funeral, you took it off in the church, and you used to take it off when we said grace at family dinners. But you don't anymore." Emma watched her grandfather's face go pale beneath his weathered tan. She could see the muscle in his jaw ticking, the way his knuckles had gone white where they gripped the barbecue spatula. Around the yard, conversations had quietly died as the adults tuned in to this unexpected confrontation between a 6-year-old's honesty and a 70-year-old's carefully constructed defenses. "Lucy, come help me set the table," Sarah called out, her voice bright with the kind of forced cheer that meant she was trying to defuse a situation before it exploded. But Lucy was like a dog with a bone, her curiosity undaunted by adult attempts at redirection. "Is there something wrong with your head, Grandpa? Is that why you won't take your hat off?" The question hit Frank like a physical blow. Emma saw him sway slightly, one hand reaching out to steady himself against the grill. For a moment she thought he might actually tell the truth, might finally admit that something was terribly wrong and that he needed help. Instead, Frank Mitchell did what he'd been doing for 3 months. He lied. "There's nothing wrong with me that a little peace and quiet wouldn't cure," he said, his voice deliberately light. "Now why don't you go play with your cousins while I finish these burgers?" The thunder rumbled again, closer this time, and the first stirrings of wind began to rustle the leaves of the old oak tree that dominated the backyard. Emma noticed the way her grandfather's eyes kept darting toward the sky, the nervous energy in his movements as he flipped the burgers with jerky, unsteady motions. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling dust across the yard and sending paper plates skittering across the picnic table. Someone's empty soda can went rolling across the grass, chased by 2 of the younger kids who turned it into an impromptu game. The adults began moving with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to Texas weather, securing lightweight items and moving chairs away from the increasingly restless oak tree. "Maybe we should move this inside," suggested Emma's Aunt Linda, Tom's wife, as she gathered napkins that were trying to escape in the wind. "Nonsense," Frank replied, though Emma noticed the way he was gripping his baseball cap with one hand while trying to manage the spatula with the other. Little bit of wind never hurt anybody. But this wasn't a little bit of wind anymore. The approaching storm front was bringing with it the kind of gusts that could strip leaves from trees and send debris flying across yards. Emma watched with growing alarm as her grandfather struggled to keep his cap in place, while simultaneously trying to maintain his dignity and finish cooking the family's dinner. The moment stretched like a held breath, full of tension that everyone could feel but no one wanted to acknowledge. Emma found herself moving closer to her grandfather, drawn by an instinct she couldn't quite name. Something was about to happen. She could feel it in the electric air, in the way the wind was building to something bigger than just weather. Frank's grip on his cap was slipping. Emma could see the white of his knuckles where he pressed the battered fabric against his skull, could see the tremor in his other hand as he tried to maintain the pretense of normalcy. Around the yard, her family continued their conversations and their preparations for the coming storm, unaware that they were about to witness something that would change everything. The wind gusted again, harder this time, and Frank stumbled slightly. His hand slipped, and for just a moment, barely a heartbeat, the edge of his cap lifted enough for Emma to catch a glimpse of what lay beneath. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. The red spots she'd glimpsed days earlier had multiplied and deepened into something that looked like raw, infected craters. Even in that brief flash, she could see the angry inflammation, the patches where Scalp had given way to something worse, the telltale gleam of infection that meant her grandfather wasn't just sick, he was dying. And then the next gust of wind hit like the fist of an angry god, and everything changed forever. The wind hit with the sudden fury of a Texas thunderstorm, sending Frank's beloved Astros cap sailing through the air like a wounded bird. Time seemed to crystallize into individual frames, each second stretching into eternity as the fabric tumbled end over end across the backyard, carrying with it 3 months of carefully guarded secrets. Frank's hands shot up instinctively, his weathered fingers grasping at empty air where his protective barrier had been just moments before. But it was too late. 67 years of stubborn pride had been stripped away in an instant, leaving him exposed and vulnerable under the harsh Texas sun. Emma's scream shattered the afternoon like breaking glass. "Oh my God, Grandpa!" The 13-year-old stumbled backward, her hamburger dropping forgotten to the patio stones as she stared in horror at her grandfather's revealed scalp. What she saw would haunt her dreams for months to come, a landscape of infection and decay that belonged in a medical textbook, not on the head of the man who'd taught her to ride a bicycle and tie her shoes. Deep, circular wounds dotted Frank's scalp like angry red craters, each one perfectly round and varying in depth from shallow indentations to horrifying caverns that revealed glimpses of bone beneath. Some wept yellow pus that had been trapped beneath his cap for God knows how long, while others had developed a black necrotic edge that spoke of tissue death and systemic infection. The sweet, sickly smell that Emma had been noticing for weeks suddenly made terrible sense. It was the smell of her grandfather's body literally rotting from the inside out. Sarah's coffee mug exploded against the concrete patio, sending ceramic shards skittering across the surface as she stared in disbelief at her father. The other 7 grandchildren froze mid-conversation, their faces transforming from Sunday afternoon contentment to pure horror as the reality of what they were seeing penetrated their shock. "Jesus Christ, Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. How long have you been hiding this?" Frank's hands trembled as he reached desperately for his fallen cap, but the wind had carried it into the neighbor's yard, leaving him defenseless against his family's horrified stares. His scalp, fully exposed for the first time in months, revealed the true extent of his suffering. The infections had spread far beyond what Emma had glimpsed in her brief sightings. Nearly half of his head was affected, with some wounds so deep they seemed to go all the way to the skull. The younger children began to cry, turning away from the sight of their grandfather's ravaged head. Lucy, the 6-year-old who had been asking innocent questions just minutes before, buried her face in her mother's skirt and began sobbing with the kind of primal fear that comes from seeing something your mind can't process. "Get the kids inside," Sarah commanded, her training as a mother overriding her shock. "Linda, Tom, get them away from this. Now!" But even as the adults began herding the traumatized children toward the house, their eyes kept returning to Frank, who stood swaying beside the barbecue grill like a man whose world had just collapsed around him. The proud veteran who had never shown weakness in front of his family was completely broken, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he tried unsuccessfully to cover his head with his hands. "I'm sorry," Frank whispered, his voice cracking with shame and pain. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want you to see." "I didn't want anyone to see." Sarah moved toward her father with the careful steps of someone approaching a wounded animal. Up close, the smell was overwhelming, a nauseating combination of infection, medication, and human suffering that made her eyes water. "Dad, we need to call 911 right now. This is serious. This is life-threatening serious." "No," Frank said, backing away from his daughter with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. "No hospitals, no doctors. I can't afford it, and I won't burden this family with more debt. I won't do to you what I did to your mother." "What you did to Mom?" Sarah's voice rose to near hysteria. "Dad, you tried to save her. You sold everything we had trying to save her. And now you're going to die of pride and stupidity because you won't let us help you." Emma, who had been frozen in shock since her initial scream, suddenly found her voice. "Grandpa, please," she said, stepping closer despite the horrific sight before her. "Please, let us help you. I've been researching your symptoms for weeks. I know you're sick. I know you're in pain. And I know that without treatment, infections like this can kill you." Frank stared at his youngest granddaughter, seeing for the first time the fear and love and desperate determination in her 13-year-old eyes. You knew?" "I suspected," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "I found the pill bottles in the trash. I saw you flinch every time someone got near your head. I noticed the smell, and the way you stopped sleeping, and the way Mom looked at you like she was afraid you were going to disappear." The wind continued to howl around them, but the family had formed a tight circle around Frank, creating a barrier of love and desperation that felt both protective and suffocating. Uncle Tom had pulled out his cell phone and was already dialing 911, ignoring Frank's weak protests. "This is Tom Mitchell," he spoke into the phone, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I need an ambulance at 1247 Maple Street. My brother has severe infected wounds on his scalp that appear to have been festering for months. Yes, he's conscious, but the wounds are deep, and there's significant tissue necrosis. Please, hurry." Frank's legs finally gave out, and he collapsed into one of the plastic lawn chairs, his head in his hands. "You don't understand," he moaned. "The bills will destroy this family. Sarah's already working herself to death trying to help me, and now this. Emma's college fund. Everything you've all worked for. It'll all be gone." Sarah knelt beside her father's chair, taking his trembling hands in hers. "Dad, look at me. Look at me right now." When he reluctantly raised his eyes to meet hers, she continued, "Do you really think money matters more to us than you do? Do you really think any of us would choose a college fund over your life?" In the distance, the wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the wind and the sound of crying children being comforted inside the house. The neighbors had begun to gather on their porches and in their yards, drawn by the commotion and the approaching ambulance. Frank's shame deepened as he realized their family's crisis was becoming a public spectacle. "I was supposed to take care of everyone," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was my job. A man takes care of his family, provides for them, protects them. I failed Martha, and now I'm failing all of you." Emma moved to stand beside her mother, placing her small hand on her grandfather's shoulder with infinite gentleness. "Grandpa, taking care of your family includes taking care of yourself. You can't protect us if you're dead." The sirens were getting closer now, and Frank could see the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of neighboring houses. In just a few minutes, paramedics would swarm his backyard, and whatever remained of his privacy and dignity would be completely stripped away. But as he looked around at the faces of his family, Sarah's desperate love, Emma's mature determination, Tom's steady support, he began to understand that maybe, just maybe, accepting help wasn't the same as admitting defeat. The ambulance turned onto Maple Street, its lights painting the gathering crowd of neighbors in alternating red and blue. Frank Mitchell, the man who had built houses and raised children and survived wars and buried the love of his life, finally stopped running from the truth. He was dying, and he needed help, and sometimes needing help was the bravest thing a man could do. The tragedy was that it had taken 3 months of suffering and a freak gust of wind for him to figure that out. The emergency room at St. David's Medical Center buzzed with the controlled chaos that defined Sunday evenings in Austin. Frank Mitchell sat on the examination table wearing a hospital gown that left him feeling more exposed than when the wind had blown away his baseball cap. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his ravaged scalp, making the infected wounds look even more grotesque than they had in the natural sunlight of his backyard. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a young resident with kind eyes and steady hands, finished her examination and stepped back with an expression that Frank had learned to read over the course of Martha's illness. It was the look medical professionals wore when they were trying to figure out how to deliver bad news without completely devastating their patients. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, pulling up a rolling stool to sit at eye level with him, "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you're the kind of man who appreciates honesty. These infections are severe. Based on what I can see, you've been dealing with this for at least 3 months, possibly longer. The good news is that we caught it before it spread to your brain or bloodstream. The bad news is that you're going to need immediate surgery to clean out the infected tissue, followed by weeks of intensive antibiotic treatment. Frank's weathered hands gripped the edge of the examination table. And the cost, Doc? Let's not dance around that particular elephant in the room. Dr. Martinez glanced at her clipboard and Frank saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The initial surgery and first week of treatment will run approximately $85,000. If complications arise, or if we need to do additional procedures, that number could climb significantly. Sarah, who had been standing silently in the corner, made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. $85,000, she repeated, her voice hollow. Dad, that's more than I make in 2 years. Through the thin walls of the examination room, Frank could hear the sounds of the emergency department, monitors beeping, conversations between medical staff, the squeak of wheels on linoleum floors. Each sound reminded him of Martha's final days, of the mounting bills that had eventually cost them their home and their life savings. There has to be another option, Frank said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man watching his worst nightmares come to life. Some kind of payment plan, or maybe we could try a less expensive treatment? Dr. Martinez shook her head slowly. Mr. Mitchell, I need you to understand something. These aren't surface wounds that we can treat with topical antibiotics. The infection has eaten away significant portions of your scalp, and in some areas it's reached the bone. Without aggressive surgical intervention, you're looking at sepsis, brain infection, and death. Probably within the next 2 weeks. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. 2 weeks. After surviving Korea, raising a daughter, building a life with his bare hands, and losing the love of his life to cancer, he was going to die of something as stupid as infected scalp wounds because he'd been too proud to ask for help. Dad, Sarah said, moving to stand beside the examination table, we'll figure out the money. I can take out loans. Maybe refinance the house. What house? Frank's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. I lost the house, remember? I sold it to pay for your mother's treatment, and I don't even have the guts to tell my grandchildren that their grandfather is a failure who lost the family home. A soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation, and a middle-aged woman in a navy blue blazer entered, carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who dealt with financial disasters for a living. Mr. Mitchell. I'm Karen Rodriguez from Financial Services. I need to discuss payment options for your treatment. Frank felt his stomach drop even further. He'd been through this dance before with Martha, had sat in countless sterile rooms while well-meaning administrators explained payment plans and charity care applications and all the various ways the medical system tried to squeeze blood from stones. Your insurance will cover approximately 40% of the projected costs, Karen continued, consulting her tablet with practiced efficiency. That leaves you with a balance of roughly $51,000. We can arrange a payment plan, but given your income level, you'd be looking at monthly payments of around $800 for the next 7 years. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. $800 a month. Dad's pension is $1,200 total, and $600 of that goes to rent. There are charity care programs, Karen offered, though her tone suggested she didn't hold much hope for that avenue. But the approval process can take weeks, and based on what Dr. Martinez has told me, time isn't something we have in abundance. Frank stared at the floor tiles, counting the small black speckles in the white linoleum as if they held the answer to an impossible equation. $800 a month, $51,000 total, numbers that might as well have been 51 million for all the hope he had of paying them. What if we don't do the surgery? He asked quietly. Dad! Sarah's voice was sharp with panic. Doctor. Martinez leaned forward, her expression serious. Mr. Mitchell, without treatment, the infection will continue to spread. You'll develop sepsis, which will cause organ failure. You'll slip into a coma, and you'll die. It won't be peaceful and it won't be quick. But my family won't be destroyed by medical debt, Frank replied. They won't lose everything trying to save a stubborn old man who should have asked for help months ago. The room fell silent, except for the ambient sounds of the hospital filtering through the walls. Frank could feel the weight of his daughter's stare, could sense Dr. Martinez's frustration with a system that forced patients to choose between life and financial ruin. But more than anything, he could feel the ghost of Martha's presence, her voice echoing in his memory with the promise he'd made and broken. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Martinez said finally, "can I tell you something off the record? I've been working in emergency medicine for 8 years, and I've seen hundreds of patients in your exact situation. You know what the real tragedy is? It's not the money. Money can be earned, debts can be paid, houses can be rebuilt. The tragedy is families losing someone they love because that person was too proud to let them help." She stood up and moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "I'm going to give you some time to discuss this as a family, but I need a decision within the next hour. Every minute we wait, the infection spreads a little further." After she left, Frank and Sarah sat in silence for several minutes. Through the small window in the examination room door, Frank could see Emma pacing in the waiting area, her young face etched with worry that no 13-year-old should have to carry. Tom and Linda were there too, along with several of the older grandchildren who had insisted on coming to the hospital despite their parents' attempts to shield them from the crisis. "Dad," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something. I've been working 3 jobs for the past 2 months. Not 2. I've been cleaning offices until 3 in the morning, then getting up at 6 to open the diner. I've saved almost $15,000. Frank's head snapped up, his eyes meeting his daughter's for the first time since they'd arrived at the hospital. "Sarah, you can't. You have your own kids to think about, your own future." "My future includes my father being alive to see his grandchildren graduate from high school," she replied firmly. "Emma's been researching college scholarships for months. She's got her heart set on studying medicine, and she's smart enough to get a full ride somewhere. The other kids have plans too, dreams that don't require inheritance money to come true." $15,000 won't make a dent in $51,000, Frank said, though his voice lacked some of its earlier resignation. Sarah smiled for the first time since the wind had blown away her father's secrets. "Dad, you taught me that when a job seems impossible, you break it down into smaller pieces and tackle them one at a time. Maybe we can't pay $51,000 right now, but we can make a start. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to handle the rest." Frank looked out at his family in the waiting room, at the faces of people who loved him enough to fight for his life, even when he'd given up fighting for himself. For the first time in 3 months, he began to think that maybe asking for help wasn't the same as admitting defeat. Maybe it was just admitting that he was human. 3 days after Frank Mitchell's emergency surgery, Emma Thompson sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her grandfather's hospital bed, her laptop balanced precariously on her knees as she typed with the determined focus of someone on a mission. The surgery had been successful. Dr. Martinez had managed to clean out most of the infected tissue and install drainage tubes that would help prevent future complications. But the financial reality remained as daunting as ever. "What are you working on so intently over there, sweetheart?" Frank asked, his voice still hoarse from the anesthesia but stronger than it had been in months. The constant pain that had been his companion for so long was finally manageable with proper medical treatment, and for the first time since Martha's death, he felt like himself again. Emma looked up from her screen, and Frank was struck by the mature determination in her 13-year-old eyes. "I'm writing your story, Grandpa. About what happened, about why you hid your illness, about what it's like when people can't afford health care in America. I'm going to post it online and see if we can raise money to help with your medical bills." Frank's first instinct was to protest, to maintain what remained of his privacy and dignity. But as he watched his granddaughter's fingers flying across the keyboard, he realized that dignity was a luxury his family could no longer afford. "Emma, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want to be anyone's charity case." "Grandpa," Emma said, her voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years, "remember what you taught me about building things? You said that sometimes you need help lifting the heavy pieces, and that doesn't make you weak. It makes you smart enough to know when to ask for assistance." She turned the laptop toward him so he could see what she'd written. The headline read, "Help my hero grandfather who nearly died because he couldn't afford health care." Below it was a photograph Tom had taken at the hospital. Frank in his hospital bed, smiling weakly at the camera, his bandaged head a stark reminder of how close they'd come to losing him. The story Emma had written was raw and honest, detailing Frank's 3 months of suffering in silence, the financial devastation that had followed Martha's cancer treatment, and the impossible choice between medical care and financial ruin that too many American families faced. She'd included details about Frank's military service, his 45 years of hard work in construction, and his fierce love for his family that had nearly killed him. "I've already posted it on GoFundMe, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram," Emma continued, her excitement growing as she spoke. "Aunt Linda helped me set up all the accounts, and Mom shared it with everyone she knows from work. Look, we've already raised $300 in the past 2 hours." Frank stared at the screen, watching as the donation counter slowly climbed. $350, $400. The comments section was filling up with messages of support from strangers who had been touched by his story, people sharing their own experiences with medical debt and healthcare struggles. "I don't know what to say," Frank admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Sarah said from the doorway, carrying a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been sitting in the waiting room for hours. "You just have to get better, and let us help you for once in your stubborn life." Over the next 24 hours, Emma's post began to gain traction in ways none of them had anticipated. The story was shared hundreds of times on social media, picked up by local news stations, and eventually went viral on TikTok when a popular health advocate with 2 million followers shared Emma's video plea for her grandfather. The donations poured in from across the country, $10 from a retired teacher in Maine, $50 from a construction worker in California who said Frank's story reminded him of his own father, $100 from a woman in Florida whose husband had died of a treatable condition because they couldn't afford proper medical care. By the end of the second day, the GoFundMe had raised over $20,000. Emma could barely contain her excitement as she refreshed the page every few minutes, watching the numbers climb steadily higher. But the real surprise came on Thursday morning when Dr. Martinez appeared in Frank's room with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since they'd met her. "Mr. Mitchell, I have some interesting news for you," she said, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "It turns out that your case has caught the attention of some people in the medical community. A group of doctors who specialize in healthcare advocacy has offered to cover the remaining costs of your treatment through their charitable foundation." Frank stared at her in disbelief. "I don't understand. Why would they do that?" "Because your story illustrates a problem that many of us in medicine see every day," Dr. Martinez explained. "Patients who delay treatment or avoid care entirely because they can't afford it. Your granddaughter's post has been shared by dozens of healthcare professionals who want to use your case as an example of why we need better systems in place to help people like you." Sarah sank into the chair beside Emma's, tears streaming down her face. "Are you saying that Dad's medical bills are completely covered? The surgery, the hospital stay, the follow-up care, the antibiotics, everything," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "And the money you've raised through the GoFundMe campaign is yours to keep. Maybe use it to help your family get back on solid financial ground." Emma looked up from her laptop, where the donation counter now showed over $35,000 and climbing. "Grandpa, people are sharing their own stories in the comments. Look at this one. My father died last year because we couldn't afford his heart medication. Thank you for sharing your story and showing that it's okay to ask for help." Frank read through comment after comment, each one a testament to the struggles faced by ordinary American families trying to navigate an impossible healthcare system. Stories of rationing insulin, skipping treatments, choosing between medications and rent money. His private shame had become a shared experience, connecting him to thousands of people he'd never met, but who understood exactly what he'd been going through. "I spent 3 months thinking I was the only one," he said quietly. "Thinking I was a failure because I couldn't afford to take care of myself. But we're not alone in this, are we?" "No, Dad," Sarah said, taking his hand in both of hers. "We're not alone. And neither are all the people who are reading Emma's post and realizing they don't have to suffer in silence either." Emma closed her laptop and moved to sit on the edge of Frank's hospital bed. "Grandpa, I want to ask you something. When you get better, will you help me start a support group for families dealing with medical debt? I think there are a lot of people in our community who could use someone to talk to, someone who understands what they're going through." Frank looked at his granddaughter, this remarkable young woman who had taken his deepest shame and turned it into a beacon of hope for others, and felt something shift in his chest. For months, he'd seen his illness as a burden, his financial struggles as a personal failure. But Emma was showing him a different perspective. His experience could be a source of strength and support for others facing similar challenges. "You know what, sweetheart?" Frank said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I think that's exactly what we should do. Your grandmother always said that the best way to heal from pain is to help others who are hurting." Emma grinned and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to start researching how to set up a non-profit organization, and I'm going to document everything we do so other families can learn from our experience." As Frank watched his granddaughter dive into her new project with the same determination she'd brought to saving his life, he realized that the wind that had blown away his baseball cap 3 days ago hadn't just exposed his physical wounds, it had blown away the walls of pride and shame that had been isolating him from the people who loved him most. For the first time since Martha's death, Frank Mitchell felt like he had a purpose again. And this time, that purpose included letting other people help him carry the load. 6 months after that life-changing Sunday barbecue, Frank Mitchell stood in his own backyard once again. But everything had changed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass where his family had gathered for another monthly barbecue, and for the first time in over a year, Frank wasn't wearing a baseball cap. His scalp had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered. The house behind him was officially his again. The generous donations from Emma's viral campaign, combined with the medical foundation's coverage of his treatment costs, had given the family enough financial breathing room to buy back the home Frank had built with his own hands 45 years ago. But more than the house, what had been restored was something far more precious: the bonds between 3 generations of Mitchells who had learned that love meant letting people help you, not just helping others. Emma, now 14 and somehow even more determined than before, was setting up a laptop at the picnic table that Frank had repaired the previous weekend. Today marked the 6-month anniversary of Frank's Friends, the support group they'd started for families dealing with medical debt and healthcare struggles. What had begun as informal meetings in their living room had grown into a recognized nonprofit organization that now served over 200 families in the Austin area. "Grandpa, Mrs. Henderson from Channel 8 News is here," Emma called out, waving toward a woman with a camera crew who had just arrived to document their story for a feature about community healthcare initiatives. She wants to interview you about how the support group has grown." Frank smoothed down his shirt, a new one that Sarah had bought him with money she'd saved from not having to work 3 jobs anymore, and walked over to greet the reporter. 6 months ago, the thought of discussing his personal struggles on television would have mortified him. Today, he saw it as an opportunity to reach other proud seniors who might be suffering in silence the way he had. "Mr. Mitchell," the reporter began once her cameraman had set up, "your story has inspired thousands of people across the country to seek help for medical issues they'd been ignoring due to financial concerns. What would you say to someone watching this who might be in a similar situation?" Frank looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the letters and emails Emma had shown him from people who had read their story. "I'd say that asking for help isn't giving up. It's giving your family the gift of keeping you around a little longer. I spent 3 months thinking I was protecting the people I love by hiding my illness, but what I was really doing was robbing them of the chance to help me, and potentially robbing them of their grandfather, their father, their friend." Sarah watched from the kitchen window as her father spoke with a confidence and openness that still amazed her. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been difficult conversations, moments of backsliding into old patterns of stubborn independence, and tears as they'd worked through the trauma of nearly losing each other. But gradually, Frank had learned to accept help gracefully, and the family had learned to offer support without making him feel diminished. The reporter continued, "Your granddaughter Emma has become something of a young activist for healthcare accessibility. How does it feel to see her channel this experience into helping others?" Frank's face broke into the kind of smile that had been absent from their family gatherings for far too long. "Emma taught me that sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting you're not strong enough to handle everything alone. She turned our family's darkest moment into a beacon of hope for others, and I couldn't be prouder of the young woman she's becoming." Emma blushed at her grandfather's praise but continued typing on her laptop, updating the Frank's Friends website with information about their latest initiative, a partnership with local doctors to provide low-cost clinic services for uninsured seniors. What had started as a desperate attempt to save her grandfather had evolved into a mission to ensure that no other family would have to face the impossible choice between medical care and financial survival. After the news crew finished their interview and packed up their equipment, the extended Mitchell family began arriving for their monthly gathering. But now these barbecues included more than just blood relatives. They'd become community events where members of Frank's Friends support group joined the family for food, conversation, and the kind of camaraderie that comes from shared struggles and mutual support. Tom arrived with his wife Linda and their kids, followed by several families from the support group. There was Mrs. Patterson, an 82-year-old widow who had been rationing her diabetes medication until Frank convinced her to apply for assistance programs. Behind her came the Johnsons, a couple in their 60s who had been facing bankruptcy due to her husband's cancer treatment until the group helped them navigate insurance appeals and find additional resources. "Frank, my friend," called out Miguel Santos, a 59-year-old former construction worker who had become Frank's closest ally in the support group. "How's the head feeling today?" "Right as rain," Frank replied, running his hand over his healed scalp without self-consciousness. "Though I still catch myself reaching for a hat sometimes when the sun gets too bright." They all laughed, the easy laughter of people who had been through hell together and come out stronger on the other side. Frank marveled at how natural it felt now to discuss his medical issues openly, to check in on others' health concerns, to offer practical advice about navigating insurance claims and medical bills. As the afternoon wore on, Frank found himself in conversation with Dr. Martinez, who had become a regular volunteer with Frank's Friends after being so moved by their story. She was explaining new programs at the hospital designed to identify and help patients who might be avoiding necessary care due to financial concerns. "You know, Mr. Mitchell," she said, "your case has become something of a teaching tool in medical schools. We use your story to help young doctors understand the real-world impact of healthcare costs on patient behavior." Frank shook his head in amazement. "6 months ago, I was ready to die rather than admit I needed help. Now you're telling me my stubbornness is being used to educate doctors?" "Your stubbornness, and more importantly, your willingness to overcome it," Dr. Martinez corrected with a smile. "The lesson isn't that pride is always wrong. It's that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is set pride aside when the stakes are high enough." Emma approached with her laptop, showing them the latest statistics from their website. "Grandpa, look at this. We've had over 50,000 people visit our resource page this month. And the support group model we developed is being replicated in 12 other cities across the country." Frank studied the screen, still amazed by his granddaughter's technical skills and organizational abilities. "You know, Emma, when I was your age, if someone had told me that a 13-year-old girl would someday save my life using something called the Internet, I'd have thought they were talking science fiction." 14 now, Emma corrected with a grin. "And it wasn't the Internet that saved you, Grandpa. It was love. The Internet was just the tool we used to share that love with a wider community." As the sun began to set over their rebuilt lives, Frank stood at the same spot where his baseball cap had been blown away 6 months earlier. But instead of hiding shameful secrets, he was now surrounded by family and friends who knew his whole story and loved him not despite his struggles, but because of how he'd chosen to transform those struggles into something meaningful. Sarah joined him, slipping her arm through his in the comfortable way of people who had weathered storms together. "Any regrets, Dad?" Frank considered the question seriously. "I regret waiting so long to ask for help. I regret the pain I put this family through by trying to handle everything alone. But I don't regret where we ended up. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the thing that teaches you what really matters." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Emma teach some of the younger kids how to set up folding chairs for the evening's support group meeting. The girl who had screamed in horror at the sight of her grandfather's infected scalp had become a confident young leader who spoke at community meetings and corresponded with families across the country who were facing similar challenges. Frank Mitchell had spent most of his life believing that strength meant carrying burdens alone, that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that a man's worth was measured by his ability to provide for his family without assistance from others. It had taken nearly dying to learn that real strength sometimes meant opening your hands and letting others help you carry the load. And in letting others help him, he had discovered something even more valuable than the money that had been raised or the medical bills that had been paid. He had found his way back to the truth that Martha had always known, that families were strongest when they faced their challenges together, and that love was not diminished by admitting you needed it, but magnified by accepting it with grace. A message to our fellow Americans, 55 to 68. Frank Mitchell's story isn't just about one stubborn grandfather in Texas. It's about the quiet crisis happening in communities across America, where proud seniors are choosing between dignity and health, between independence and survival. You've worked hard your entire lives, raised families, served your country, and built communities with your own hands. But somewhere along the way, we were taught that needing help means failing, that asking for assistance diminishes our worth. Frank nearly died holding on to this lie. His 13-year-old granddaughter saved his life not with money or medicine, but by showing him that true strength isn't suffering alone. It's letting love win over pride. Every day, thousands of seniors are hiding medical problems, rationing medications, or avoiding treatment because they can't afford the cost or can't bear the shame of needing help. You are not alone in this struggle, and you are not weak for needing support. Your families need you alive more than they need your pride intact. Your stories matter, your health matters, and your life has value beyond your ability to pay medical bills. Questions for reflection. Have you ever delayed seeking medical care because of financial concerns? And what would you tell your younger self about the importance of health over financial pride? What traditions or values from your generation do you think we should hold on to, and which ones might be hurting us in today's world? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.